So, Dungeons and Dragons has been around for decades at this point. And this will be the third part in my discussion of Dungeons and Dragons. In particular, I'll be doing sort of a survey of the history of Dungeons and Dragons. A lot of people may have sort of dropped into D&D at some point or another in their college or high school, but didn't keep up with it or weren't aware of the history of the game. And, I don't plan on doing a detailed breakdown of the history from a deeply scholarly standpoint. I'm not going to go through all the historical events. But giving a nice overview might help people who find themselves looking at a book and they don't know why it's important, or, the influences that went into it, and, why we have edition wars and things like that. I think the first thing that you have to understand with D&D is D&D started as something else. The wargaming community has been around for years, possibly centuries if you trace it in such a way. H.G. Wells even wrote a wargaming manual called Little Wars. It's where he came up with rules for doing, running, miniature battle wars. But most of the time with wargaming, you were commanding, broader units. Here's my squad of these guys, and this squad of these guys, and they move in, and then the artillery fires, and that sort of thing. It's also was usually used to reflect real wars, Napoleonic battles, things like that. In the 1970s, a group of enthusiasts, wargamers, started experimenting with having wargames where you controlled a single individual. And that evolved due to the influence of people like Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. Not the only ones involved, but certainly the two big names involved, evolved into Dungeons and Dragons. Now, Dungeons and Dragons has gone through a lot of iterations since then. And it had a lot of interesting influences. The early Dungeons and Dragons involved influences from Tolkien, and anyone who tells you otherwise isn't paying attention. Though, to be fair, Gygax tried to sort of subdue a lot of that influence. He changed the names of things to try and cut down on the perception that it was somehow strictly taken from Tolkien, and it wasn't. There's some influences by the works of Jack Vance, Roger Zelazny, H.P. Lovecraft, Wellspring de Camp. It had a lot of different influences in it. And they actually list them in one of the early Dungeon Masters guides, that an appendix listing influences exists. And the Tome Show has this wonderful sort of sub-series. The Tome Show is a podcast that I listen to. It's put together by Jeff Greiner and Tracy Hurley and company. But he often has people come in and do sub-shows for them, and one of them is based off of going through that appendix. I think it's Appendix N, but I maybe be wrong on that. And finding all the books listed there and reading them all to sort of get an idea of the influences involved. But all of these influences influenced the overall makeup of what was Dungeons and Dragons. Now, in the later 1970s, they began to take sort of a split marketing plan, I guess. They had AD&D, the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons books, And then they had the basic Dungeons and Dragons books. And the basic Dungeons and Dragons books actually strongly kind of resemble some of the early D&D. The notion of race and class being sort of a combined element is certainly there. Elves are elves. They're not like, it's a little different in their in that format than it was in the advanced D&D or some of the later editions. The basic Dungeons and Dragons was more or less, here is what D&D is supposed to be like, sort of a pure is a rough term, but a more pure version of Dungeons and Dragons as it was originally conceived. Whereas Advanced Dungeons and Dragons had a lot more variation in the rules, a lot more room for experimentation. A lot of the articles that you would find in Dragon Magazine was more oriented towards that rule set. This is also when you got the Greyhawk supplement. The Greyhawk setting was in the 1970s, the late 1970s. It began to sort of form into a thing. And really that was the default setting to a certain extent for a good number of years until, you had the known world setting for D&D, the base D&D, that appeared in the Gazetteers and some of the adventures. And that was sort of a separate thing from Greyhawk. And that was early 80s. And actually, I have a strong affection for the known world setting. There were at some point it felt like somebody took the reins off and said, "Yeah, do experiment, do whatever you want with it," and they came up with a really interesting world. It's your standard fantasy world tropes, but a couple of people put some serious work into making that an interesting world. You had Aphasia and Thyatis, the Principalities of Gallantry, and a bunch of other nations that were part of that. Also in the 80s, we begin to see the rise of the Forgotten Realms. Now, the Forgotten Realms is, it's interesting to look at the old Forgotten Realms box set. Ed Grudenwood sort of came up with Forgotten Realms, though over the years he had a lot of help with it. But in his mind, he felt like it was more real, I guess, more breathed in. You knew where things came from. You knew where people got their coffee. You knew how the world fit together to a certain extent. It's still, to this day, a bit of a go-to for generic fantasy settings. But that's okay. That's not terrible. Sometimes you just need the sort of reliable meat and potatoes fantasy setting, and Forgotten Realms is that setting. The next edition of D&D will be featuring that setting, so it's sort of coming back around to that. Now, also in the 80s, they came up with a number of odd experiments. You ended up with, Dark Sun, which was a sort of post-apocalyptic fantasy where the world is almost a desert with little oases of city run by sorcerer kings. And the most fearful thing in the world is the Athasian dragon, which is sort of what happens when Sorcerer King reaches its final form. There are no gods there, and arcane magic hurts the world. So it's sort of a lot of crazy ideas built into it. It's pretty cool, but it's really odd. You also have Spelljammer, which I loved, but I realized that I may be alone in this. Spelljammer, the idea was you could travel through the sky on your spaceship. And when I say spaceship, I don't mean like the USS Enterprise. It was your ship that flies through space. Just like, an airship or a sea-going vessel. You just happen to traverse the sky and could travel between the crystal spheres, which basically represented the different worlds that you could go to. And it's a big idea kind of setting. There are folks who really hated that. I loved it. I thought it was amazing. But I recognize that I may be alone in that. Or at least not alone, but in the minority. Still, portions of stuff from Spelljammer did make it into the 3rd and 4th edition. And I will be surprised if portions of it doesn't make it into the 5th edition. Also came out with Ravenloft, which was their sort of generic horror setting. And by generic, I don't mean to say that it didn't have its own sort of mythos to it, but you had vampires, you had werewolves, you had the Frankenstein-style monsters. It was designed for more horror-oriented D&D games. Now, all of those are big things, but D&D always sort of struggled on the edge of being profitable and not being profitable. Partly due to mismanagement on a couple of occasions. More than a few occasions, honestly. And partly because, it's a fringe hobby. And it never really got mainstream acceptance. So any kind of hiccup didn't have the sort of bounce to it to allow it to survive those hiccups quite as well. Now, that being said, D&D is and has always been the most iconic of role-playing games. Pretty much everyone's heard of it. Maybe not everybody has played it, but almost everyone's heard of it. Jump forward a few years to the 1990s, the late 1990s, and a company called Wizards of the Coast comes along. They decide they're going to buy D&D from the company that owned it up until then, TSR. Now, funny thing, true story, I was at a convention once. And there were a bunch of guys from Wizards of the Coast there. And they were going on and on about how they were going to be the next TSR. And I laughed at them. Because I thought, that's ridiculous. TSR is D&D, and D&D isn't going away, and these guys are just an upstart, and blah, blah, blah. Not long after that, they bought TSR, so wow, was I wrong. That's where I'm at on that. You never know. Sometimes people are just going to be able to, pull it together and change things. And they did. They changed things. Shortly after they got it, they started 3rd edition, which was a fairly radical change. They had a 2nd edition, which streamlined a lot of the rules, but towards the end of second edition, they started adding rules. They started adding a bunch of things to experiment with, to make the game more customized. And so, third edition came along, and they incorporated a lot of the things that they came up with in late second edition. So you had a much more robust skill system. You had a greater attention to the notion of game balance when it came to trying to figure out, what treasure to hand out, what kind of monsters to put on a module, to come up with ways of figuring out how much of any particular monster can fit against however many players. It included rules for applying player-based classes to monster races to give them variety and make them interesting. There were a lot of interesting ideas in 3rd edition. Shortly after 3rd edition came out, they came up with a 3.5, which is sort of, they realized that there were some problems with 3rd edition at launch, and they went back and added some fixes. So you ended up with 3.5. And 3.5 also saw the introduction of a new setting called Everon. And Everon was really kind of cool. It's actually, to this day, one of my favorite D&D settings, where magic is almost treated more like a technology. You have lightning rails, and skyships are sort of controlled by particular families, and there's guild warfare, and it's an interesting setting that sort of maximized on the rules to make this to make the setting that matches the rules, I guess is the best way to put that. And it works very well, and in a lot of ways it became my go-to for D&D games. Now, towards the end of 3.5, they decided they're going to do a 4th edition. And they announced that in August of 2007, I think. Yeah, because I was living in North Carolina when it came out, and I remember having a discussion with Jeff Greiner about it. The thing with D&D 4th edition was it was going to be a radical change. One of the more intriguing and actually kind of exciting things that they added to 3rd edition and 3.5 is they added a licensing system that was designed to make it easy for people to make content for D&D. The idea being, well, if you make it easy for people to make content for D&D, people will make content for the game, and people will have to buy the original game to be able to play this other content. People can come up with third-party adventures, third-party worlds, and so on, third-party additions to the rules, and it actually caused a big explosion of products coming out. Not all of them were good, mind you. Quite a few of them weren't. But it caused a sort of explosion of creativity. When 4th edition was announced, in 2007, they kind of went the other direction. They said, well, we're going to lock down the licensing a little bit more. And there are a lot of reasons that people speculated as to why. I'm not going to say for absolute certain one explanation is more true than any other. But the net result is a lot of people were very dissatisfied with the changes. Also, a lot of people liked 3.5. They thought, this is a pretty good game. We don't need a radical revision. And so, another company who had dealings with Wizards of the Coast decided they were going to make their own successor and called it Pathfinder. Pathfinder was going to be much more like 3.5, but with some slight variations. Some tweaks, but it's mainly the same rule system. 3.5, rule books have things in it that you can use in Pathfinder and vice versa. Whereas 4th edition is radically different. They changed a lot of the structures. They got rid of Vancian magic. They really changed how the game played. It made it, while it is unfortunate to hear this term bandied about, much more video game-like. Now, when it comes to saying it became much more video game-like, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Different art forms learn from different art forms. And it's pretty clear that at least some lessons from video games slid into 4th edition. And that's fine. D&D has been influencing video games for decades. Seriously, the video game landscape right now would be vastly different if not for Dungeons and Dragons. And alright, video games influence 4th edition. 4th edition was controversial. They had a solid competitor in Pathfinder, which appealed to people who were already happy with 3.5. And to add into that, you had a sort of a movement of people who were looking for old school revival games that really liked the older versions of D&D. And, you end up with a scene where you begin to hear the term edition wars, where people who are dissatisfied with 4th edition feel no compunction about telling everyone in the room about how much they hate it. Whereas people are huge fans of 4th edition, never played the previous editions, don't understand why people are, out of sorts, and they don't like that Pathfinder because it's much more convoluted and takes more time to make characters. And there were a bunch of back and forth bits to this. And somewhere along the way, in 2012, I think they announced they were working on a 5th edition. And the 5th edition, the idea behind it was, listen, we're going to return to a much more pure version of D&D, a much more refined towards the traditional version of D&D. And then we'll add bits that people can, add or not add to their games in a sort of modular format, so that you can, if you don't like fancy and magic, here's a module, you can change it to something else. That sort of thing. And 5th edition should be coming out later this summer. And I'm, of course, very excited to see it. But, there is a long history to the game. And each of the editions had some really fun times attached to them. And I can't tell people one edition is better than the other. I can tell you which ones are more complex, more confusing. I can tell you which ones had ideas that most people have gotten rid of and which ones haven't. I can tell you which ones I played, which was all of them. But the editions definitely have their own strengths and weaknesses, and you should play the one that you like, not necessarily which one's new. You can get a lot of the older editions in various formats. Wizards of the Coast released first, second, and third editions reprints, as books that you could buy, for the main books anyway. The PDFs are out there for a lot of the things that aren't in print anymore, but that you can buy. I know I've bought some of the gazetteers from the PDF sources that are available. So you can certainly go back and find all of the stuff that you need to play in any of the previous editions. The base rule systems haven't changed that much. They have variations. We got rid of Thaco, and pretty much, you have a target number or you don't. We've added more skills as time went on. A few things like that. But the base rule system, rolling a d20, comparing the number against what you need, and adding or subtracting whatever modifiers are necessary, hasn't changed that much. You roll the other kinds of dice for damage, pretty much only damage. And the damage that you do is based off of the weapon that you're using. And those basic things haven't changed much. You still have classes. You will always have classes. You will always have races. And, there are games out there that don't have those things, but they're not D&D. Those are things that are uniquely of Dungeons and Dragons. And as long as the system has some of those unique things that are only D&D, then you will find, some fun to be had. You will find it to be at least somewhat like Dungeons and Dragons. So, that's my long, rambly talk about the history of Dungeons and Dragons. I am perfectly happy to talk about any particular era that anybody has a question about. I know more than I talked about here because, I didn't want to spend weeks recording. Tell me what your favorite edition was. Tell me what your favorite setting was. Were there, any things in older versions of D&D that you loved that don't get any love anymore? Give us a talk, tell me which ones you like. But till then, I'm going to wrap this up, and you all have a good day. Subscribe, like, the usual stuff. Have a good night.